Good morning. The hearing will come to order. Let me begin by thanking everyone for joining us for today's hearing, Defending Democracy, Protecting Elections from Executive Overreach. Before I begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to the United States Secret Service, Capitol Police, and local law enforcement for their heroic work in disrupting an attack at the White House Correspondents' Dinner over the weekend. I'm relieved that the Secret Service agent who was injured is recovering and that none of the dinner's attendees were harmed. There's no room for political violence in this country, and we must not tolerate it one bit. In less than 3 months, we will observe the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. This country was founded on an idea that we are all free and equal, and that therefore each of us has a right to participate fully in governing ourselves. It was also founded on a premise that our laws would enshrine and protect these rights. These founding principles have yet to be fully realized, but each generation has fought to advance them. My initiation into activism was born of necessity. A child of the Jim Crow South, I never had a new textbook. I didn't get to use the same restaurants or water fountains as white kids my age. And there were many great people who didn't think that black people should be voting. As a college student, I worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to make sure this country lives up to the promises made in the Constitution. And the FBI created a file on me that I discovered 30 years later only because of my position in Congress. Unfortunately, I was not the only civil rights advocate the FBI was tracking. The FBI was actively monitoring a number of organizations involved in the civil rights movement and their leaders. Despite government opposition, we made progress by, among other things, getting the Voting Rights Act enacted into law and later enacting policies like early voting and mail-in voting that made voting more accessible. Those of us who have been committed to protecting voting rights have always had to be vigilant to protect them against those who believe free and fair elections don't serve their political interests. Never has this been truer than when Donald Trump made his foray into presidential politics. Since Donald Trump decided to make transition from mediocre game show host to abysmal president, the integrity of our elections has sustained one blow after another. From self-serving conspiracy theories of voter fraud and non-citizen voting to efforts to impose new barriers to registering to vote, the president has pursued his voter suppression campaign with reckless abandon. In over 5 decades I've spent fighting and protecting voting rights. I've never seen an assault on democracy more frightening or more shameful than what we experienced on January 6, 2021. As the chief congressional investigator into attack on the Capitol and the president's broader scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election outcome, I know all too well how close the president and his co-conspirators came to stealing an election and tearing our Constitution to shreds. But for a handful of people of goodwill, hundreds of brave law enforcement officers and members of Congress and staff committed to certifying election results, we would have had a constitutional crisis on our hand. To this day, Donald Trump continues to spew lies about the 2020 election, and having been entrusted once again with all the powers of the presidency, he has directed both the FBI and Office of the Director of National Intelligence to reinvestigate it. As a result, Tulsi Gabbard seized voting equipment from Puerto Rico. The FBI demanded election materials from Maricopa County, Arizona, and Tulsi Gabbard joined the FBI as it raided an election center in Fulton County, Georgia. As the president dispatches the FBI and ODNI to litigate the 2020 election results. He's trained on preserving Republican majorities in the House and Senate, which he apparently believes is aided by voter suppression policies. Ripping a page out of the 2020 Big Lie playbook, the president has been peddling conspiracy theories about massive numbers of non-citizen voting and mail-in voting fraud to justify his most outrageous anti-voter policies. He has issued unconstitutional executive orders that would, among other things, require citizenship documents to register to vote, direct DOJ to sue states that count mail-in ballots received after Election Day, require federal access to voter rolls, and order DHS and the Social Security Administration to develop a national voter list and prohibit the Postal Service from mailing a ballot to anyone not on that list. His executive orders are the subject of numerous lawsuits, leaving election officials in limbo and draining resources as they prepare for the 2026 midterm. At the end of the day, Donald Trump's election policies serve two ends: the president's fragile ego and his self-serving political prerogatives. They cast aside the very constitutional principles he was sworn twice to defend. Donald Trump's crime against democracy are too many to list, and the way we stand up to him and preserve our democracy is at the ballot box. So, we must protect access to it. Free and fair elections are the core of our democracy, and we must be vigilant in protecting them. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. And I apologize if I butcher names. I guess one of the shortcomings of that separate and unequal education was that some folk I just never had a chance to meet personally. But Mr. Deputy Secretary of State from the great state of Michigan, Go or Devi? Close. Thank you. The son of Nigerian immigrants, the Deputy Secretary began working as an election protection lawyer and poll challenger in law school and went on to serve as the Michigan State Director of a leading election protection group. All voting is local, as Deputy Secretary will tell us, and has helped make voting easier and more accessible for Michiganders. Commissioner Mo Ivey is a former county commissioner from Fulton County, Georgia. Commissioner Ivey is a seasoned attorney and law school professor. Commissioner Ivey witnesses firsthand the FBI raid on the Fulton County Election Center, and she has been a leading advocate of protecting the integrity of elections. The Honorable Kristen Clark serves as the General Counsel of the NAACP. Prior to that, Ms. Clark served as the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, leading enforcement of federal civil rights laws across the country, including voting rights. Mr. Larry Norton is Vice President of the Elections and Government Programs at the Brennan Center, where he oversees a broad national portfolio of topics, including election security and administration and election information ecosystem, among other things. He is a founding member of the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, a national partnership of election officials and law enforcement leaders addressing threats to election workers and election infrastructure. Ms. Jessica Marston is the Deputy Director of Impact Programs and Council for Civic Space and the Rule of Law at Protect Democracy. She focuses on defending Americans' rights to peacefully criticize their government and participate in political life. She also led Protect Democracy's strategic efforts to stop election subversions. I now ask each witness to summarize their statement for 5 minutes. We have a wonderful cadre of questioners here. Mr. Deputy Secretary, please be our first witness.
Thompson, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Agogo Adeviye, and I serve as Michigan's Deputy Secretary of State. Over the last 16 years, I've worked hard to protect and strengthen our elections. Sometimes that meant sitting in a polling place making sure voters in a single precinct could cast their ballots. Other times it meant working hard with broad coalitions to enshrine voting rights in our state constitution. No matter the role, the mission has been the same: to ensure every eligible citizen can participate in our democracy. And we've made real progress. Thanks to the passage of nonpartisan ballot initiatives, millions of Michiganders now have access to voting by mail, early voting, and same-day voter registration. We've set turnout records in 3 consecutive statewide elections. These achievements are the product of a system that is accessible and secure. For years, we've carried out this work with the confidence that the federal government would support us as we administered elections on behalf of the people of Michigan. But as a result of the lies told about our elections and the threats to election workers, that confidence has been destroyed. The presidency has repeatedly threatened free and fair elections and rejected our Constitution, which has made clear over the past 200 years that states, not the president, not the federal government, run elections. Just 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice sent Wayne County an unlawful letter demanding ballots and other election materials, a letter void of any basic understanding of law. The DOJ's error-riddled letter is full of mistakes that a first-year law student wouldn't even make. Off the bat, the letter itself is addressed to the wrong entity. Under Michigan law dating back at least 60 years, counties do not maintain possession of ballots. Cities and townships do. In this letter, the DOJ also cites and relies on a lawsuit that a Republican-appointed judge had already dismissed, and I'm quoting now, as incorrect and not credible. And the letter cited 3 isolated cases of fraud that were in fact caught by local election officials following established procedures. In each instance, the system worked exactly as it should. Misconduct was detected, investigated, and prosecuted. The incompetence of this administration, mixed with its determination to bludgeon and intimidate, poses a grave danger to this country. The president's most recent executive order on elections is the latest example. It won't prevent fraud, but it will prevent millions of eligible U.S. citizens from voting while causing chaos, confusion, and sowing doubt amongst voters. At the same time, this executive order goes after election clerks. These Michiganders, many of whom serve part-time, have faced threats, shrinking budgets, and now from the president, the prospect of criminal charges. It is no surprise that turnover has increased. In 2024, 36% of election officials in Michigan were new. National turnover was 41%. These challenges are compounded by the reduced federal support for election security. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, created to protect our elections from attacks and foreign interference, has been gutted. As a result, states are being tasked to shoulder more responsibility with fewer resources. But in Michigan, we're resilient. Teachers, small business owners, faith leaders, and many others are still signing up to help their friends and neighbors cast their ballots. Nearly 60% of new election officials have prior professional experience in elections. When we say elections are run well, it's due to our dedicated election officials who also refuse to be intimidated by this administration. We will continue to defend any election workers the DOJ tries to intimidate. We're ready to stand up for our voters, our rights, and our freedom to run our own elections. Make no mistake, Michigan will run Michigan's elections this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. for your testimony. I now recognize Commissioner Ivory to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Members of the Committee on Homeland Security, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Thank you especially to Ranking Member Representative Benny G. Thompson and the House Committee on Homeland Security Democrats for convening this important discussion. My name is Mo Ivory. I serve as a county commissioner in Fulton County, Georgia, the largest county in my state, and a county that has been at the center of the national fight over democracy, voting rights, and public trust in elections. I'm here today to speak plainly about what executive overreach looks like when it reaches the local level. On January 28, 2026, I received a text that our elections hub was being raided by the FBI, and I immediately went there. Federal agents executed a search warrant at the Fulton County Elections Office. They seized hundreds of boxes of election materials for the 2020 election, ballots, absentee envelopes, recap sheets, and results tapes. These were not theoretical records. These were official election materials belonging to a local government, tied to an election that had already been counted, recounted, audited, certified, and litigated. And it is important for this committee to understand what that moment felt like on the ground. For local election workers and county staff, this was not an abstract constitutional debate. It was a disruption to the daily work of administering elections. It raised immediate questions about chain of custody, voter privacy, access to public records, preservation of official materials, and whether Fulton County could continue meeting its legal obligations while federal authorities had taken possession of our documents. It also sent a message to the public servants who administer elections. Even after doing your job, even after following the law, even after audits and reviews, you can still be pulled back into a political fight over an election that ended 6 years ago. That is not normal, and it is not harmless. The search warrant itself reflected the danger of this kind of federal intervention. The original warrant contained errors serious enough that the federal government had to pause and seek a corrected warrant. That process took roughly 2 hours that day. During that time, local officials were left trying to understand the scope of federal authority, protect county records, and respond responsibly in a situation that should never have been handled casually. To be clear, Fulton County is not asking for special treatment. We are asking for the basic respect owed to local election systems, local public servants, and the voters whose information and ballots are entrusted to us. This did not happen in a vacuum. Fulton County had been targeted for years because of the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. We all remember the call asking Georgia officials to find 11,780 votes. We remember the conspiracy theories. We remember the harassment of election workers. We remember how public servants in Fulton County were vilified for just doing their job. And the pressure has continued. In 2025, the Fulton County Republican Party nominated individuals to serve on our Board of Registrations and Elections whose public conduct raised serious concerns for me about their fitness to administer elections. As a commissioner, I was asked to vote on those appointments, and I voted no. A trial court later ordered the commission to approve those appointments and threatened consequences, including substantial daily fines. But I believed then, and I believe now, that elected officials cannot be reduced to rubber stamps when the integrity of election administration is at stake. The Georgia Court of Appeals has now made clear that courts cannot force elected officials to vote a particular way. That matters because democracy depends not only on voters being able to freely cast their ballots, but also an elected official being free to exercise their judgment within the law. So when federal agents arrived at Fulton County's elections office, I did not see it as an isolated event. I saw it as part of a broader pattern about local election systems being pressured, second-guessed, and politicized because some people, and that some people is our president, Donald Trump, still refusing to accept the results of his 2020 election loss. Congress needs to understand this clearly. When federal power is used to relitigate settled elections, local election workers pay the price first. but voters pay the price last. They pay when confidence is undermined. They pay when election workers leave the profession. They pay when public resources are diverted from running current elections to defending old ones. They pay when conspiracy theories are given the force of government action. No president, no administration, and no political movement should be allowed to use the power of the federal government to intimidate local election officials or cast doubt on lawful election results without a legitimate basis. Fulton County deserves better. Georgia voters deserve better. And the American people deserve an election system where the rules are clear, the process is fair, and public servants can do their job without fear of political retaliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Clark to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson and members of the committee. On behalf of the NAACP, I thank you for holding this very timely and necessary forum today. This hearing comes at a critical time in our democracy because the threat before us is real and urgent, and because we've seen it before. The all-out effort by this administration and its cohorts in some state governments to seize control of how elections are run is the latest chapter in a very long story of power being used to silence the Black community. The NAACP has led the fight against that effort for over a century, and we are leading it today. The NAACP has spent the last several years building a framework for voter protection and civic mobilization that is working and that can be replicated by state and local governments, civil society organizations, trusted community institutions, and people all across the country. My testimony today offers a warning and a roadmap. Since the Supreme Court invalidated the preclearance provision in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, we've seen a cascade of voter suppression laws and efforts across the country. What made the Voting Rights Act transformative was that it brought federal power to bear on the side of voters. When Black Americans were threatened at the polls, they could look to the U.S. Department of Justice for protection. The vigor of enforcement may have varied across administrations. Some were more aggressive than others, but one principle held. The goal of the federal government was to protect, not harm, voters. I'm proud to have been a part of that history as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights during the last administration, when we vigorously worked to enforce the Voting Rights Act and other federal voting rights laws on behalf of all Americans. And I am dismayed to see how egregiously that work is being trampled on by this current administration, which has turned the department into an instrument of oppression and lawlessness. The Trump administration claims his executive orders suppressing the vote are necessary to combat so-called voter fraud, but we want to be very clear. These orders, despite the lies being used to sell them to the American public, are dangerous. Unlike in the past, this is not state-level voter suppression that federal intervention can remedy. It is a president of the United States now weaponizing the massive powers of the federal government machinery to control which voters can participate in American elections and which cannot. It is a blatantly unconstitutional seizure of authority. But we have an important message. It will not work. We have a plan at the NAACP and a process, and it has proven to work. The NAACP's voter protection framework is founded on two solid pillars: strong legal expertise and our civic engagement program. Our framework is working and it's scalable across the country. Our civic engagement program works with the full support of our legal program with NAACP lawyers, staff, and volunteers across the country who are the backbone for this work. our community members know that they have full legal backup and that our lawyers are fighting for them, as we have throughout the organization's long history. I close with a few things that we can all do. We can conduct year-round voter registration drives and outreach. We must maintain a vigorous online voter protection hub that gives voters the tools to register, confirm their status, understand the ballot, and locate their polling place. We must enlist and deploy lawyers in the days leading up to and on Election Day to ensure that people's rights are protected. And finally, we must have fully staffed election protection command centers across the country to field real-time incident reports and file emergency litigation when voters are turned away. The NAACP's Civic Engagement Program really shapes our organization's 115-year history. We look forward to working with this committee to push back against this administration's continued efforts to silence black voters and other eligible voters across our country.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Norton to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson and members of the committee. I'm going to use my 5 minutes to talk about election security. As I'm sure members of this committee are well aware, the Trump administration has engaged in devastating cuts in the election security support that the federal government previously offered to state and local election offices. Since taking office, the Trump administration has cut security resources and services for states. It has pushed out the expert staff who previously ran these programs, especially at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It has dismantled entities that monitored threats of foreign interference, and it has cut funding for the information sharing and analysis centers that election officials in the private sector relied upon to share information and to coordinate responses to election security threats. The Brennan Center's annual survey of local election officials makes clear how damaging these cuts are viewed. Last year, 60% of local election officials told us that they were concerned about these cuts. And just this month, in our most recent survey, 75% told us that their state and local governments had not provided enough resources to fill the gap that was created by those cuts. And perhaps most damaging of all, many election officials that we talk to no longer trust the federal partners that they used to rely on to help them coordinate around election security. While all of this is troubling, I do want to say that it's not reason for despair, and that is in large part because over the last decade there has been a lot of work done to increase security around our elections. That obviously includes the near universal adoption of paper ballots around the country, hardened networks, and a deepened civil society ecosystem that is allowing election officials around the country to absorb some of this shock. Even more importantly, the people who administer our elections across all 50 states, across both parties, in jurisdictions large and small, are professionals who serve because they believe in our democracy and elections and in serving their communities. And the processes that they oversee are bipartisan, they are transparent, and they're built with multiple layers of redundancy and verification. And all of this should instill confidence in the system that we have. Of course, threats remain, and not least of those is misinformation and lies that are told about our elections. In our poll of election officials this year, 74% said that they were concerned that the spread of false information about elections were making their jobs more difficult and more dangerous. And none of this is helped by a president and administration officials who continue to spread debunked rumors and conspiracy theories, now with the seal of the federal government. Under our system, states run elections, and there is still time to do more before the midterms. In particular, deepening coordination within their states and among the states And the model here is a whole of government approach to election security, establishing interagency election working groups to identify and coordinate support for elections, as states like Montana, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania have done, joining interstate information sharing networks to prepare for developing threats, and passing laws, state laws, to protect voters and election infrastructure from federal and outside interference. I just want to close with a final note about the people who run our election. Despite the threats and the attacks and the pulling support from the federal government and the vilification, the vast majority remain committed to staying on the job through 2028. And the reason is simple. In our survey, the reason that election officials give for doing their job is basically one of two answers. They believe in democracy and elections, or they believe in serving their communities. And that really brings me to the final point that I wanted to make about security in our elections going forward. And that's all of us, but especially our public leaders, must clearly express that baseless attacks on the workers and the systems that run our elections will not be tolerated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Marston to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Ranking Member Thompson and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak about this important subject. I serve as Director of Impact Programs at Protect Democracy, focusing on civic space and the rule of law. Our mission is to prevent the United States from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. Modern authoritarianism consolidates power not by eliminating elections, but by tilting the playing field and rigging the rules to ensure that the regime in power stays in power. Accordingly, we work to preserve Americans' ability to fairly compete for power through elections. And in 2026, the greatest threat to a free and fair election will, for the first time, come from the federal government. President Trump has repeatedly signaled that he sees any election result he opposes as illegitimate. At the same time, he has consolidated control over the executive branch and asserted his desire to nationalize elections. For those reasons, we anticipate the administration to continue their unprecedented efforts to interfere in the election process, particularly if control of Congress hangs in the balance. But as I'll address at the end, if everyone, from officials at every level all the way down to individual voters, does their part and follows the law, the administration's efforts to corrupt our elections will fail. The administration's strategy has three basic components: deceive voters about the trustworthiness of our election systems, disrupt the operation of those systems, and use the ensuing chaos to deny election outcomes they don't like. I'll say more about each of these. First, the administration will use federal resources, amplified by allies in the media and online, to deceive voters about whether they can trust elections. They will manufacture false narratives to fuel distrust and create a pretext for disrupting election administration and denying disfavored results. Second, the administration will attempt to use federal government power to disrupt the normal election process. Their goal appears to be to suppress participation and sow enough chaos to win the election. And if election results do not turn out as they are hoping, they are likely to turn to the third step in their strategy: deny the election results outright. We saw this in 2020, when President Trump led a campaign of pressure against election officials, frivolous lawsuits in the courts, and eventually violence at the Capitol to try to overturn the presidential election. We should be prepared for similar contests over election certification and post-election litigation in 2026. The administration's efforts to obtain states' confidential voter rolls exemplify this strategy at work. Since last year, the DOJ has contacted nearly every state and the District of Columbia to demand their complete unredacted voter files, which are filled with sensitive personal information like Social Security numbers, driver's license numbers, and political party affiliation. While the administration has claimed that these demands are aimed at election security, these efforts are in fact a prime example of the deceive, disrupt, deny strategy at work. First, DOJ has used these demands for voter data to spread lies about fraud in the electoral process. In fact, when election officials, Republican and Democratic, have conducted thorough reviews of their own voter files, they have found scant evidence of ineligible voters on the rolls. In Georgia, for instance, Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger found just 20 non-citizens among the 8.2 million voters on Georgia's voter rolls, and a majority of them had never cast a ballot. Second, the administration will aim to disrupt the electoral process by forcing the states to disenfranchise voters. We know the administration intends to compare registered voters' information to DHS's SAVE database. But there are serious reasons to doubt the accuracy of SAVE as a system for checking voter eligibility. For example, it often contains out-of-date citizenship information for immigrants who are later naturalized. Demanding, as the administration is now doing, that states strip voter eligibility based solely on a SAVE mismatch will lead to voter confusion, extensive litigation, and potential disenfranchisement. Finally, if, despite these efforts, the fall's election results in outcomes the administration doesn't like, they are likely to use false claims based on voter rolls to deny the results. We saw a similar strategy play out in my home state of North Carolina in 2024, when the losing candidate for the North Carolina Supreme Court fought to disqualify more than 60,000 voters because of, in most cases, missing data in the voter file, with no evidence that any unqualified voter actually cast a ballot. That effort was eventually stopped by a federal court, but it took nearly 6 months for the election to be resolved. In the context of a congressional election, this could put control of Congress up in the air for many months, if not indefinitely. But while this is a threat we need to take seriously, it can be stopped. As many are already doing in the fight over voter data, state and local officials should be prepared to robustly defend their proper role in election administration. And members of Congress also have an important role to play by using their platforms, as you all are doing today, to convey accurate information about elections and call out what the administration is doing in furtherance of its deceive, disrupt, deny strategy. I'm grateful for your time and interest, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank the witnesses for their testimony, and I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for the first series of questions. There's no question. You all are the 5 experts on this issue. It concerns a lot of us that what we're hearing from this administration versus reality of actual voting experience is different. Mr. Deputy Secretary, what's been your experience on Donald Trump's claim that huge numbers of non-citizens are voting?
Well, it's just been the exact opposite. We did an audit of our rolls after the 2024 election, and we found that a 0.0028% of voters were non-citizens and voted illegally in our election. Those people have been referred to our Attorney General. They're being prosecuted. They're being held accountable. The system works. So the president is just off base here.
Commissioner Ivory, what's your situation with non-citizens voting?
Yeah, that just doesn't exist in Georgia, as was mentioned by Mrs. Marsden, our Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who received the phone call from President Trump to fine the 11,780 votes, had investigated all of the conspiracy theories that were set forth by election deniers in Georgia, from suitcases being pulled out filled with ballots that weren't counted, to aliens voting and non-registered voters having access to the voting machines. And it just has never been found to be true and continued to be included in the affidavit for the issuance of the warrant in the raid. So these debunked theories continue to take on a new life every time there's a new attempt at trying to overturn the Fulton County elections.
Ms. Clark, you kind of looked at this from a DOJ perspective. Based on the testimony of the other 2 witnesses about illegals voting, what's been the national perspective on that?
So what the NAACP has found through its work is that the barriers to participation are the unnecessary laws and policies that we have seen put on the books, particularly in the post-Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder era, that there are eligible people who want their voices heard, who want to be able to cast ballots, and are encountering new barriers when it comes to registering to vote, encountering new barriers when it comes to accessing absentee ballots. The pretextual justifications that we see put forth by this administration, there's voter fraud, there are undocumented people trying to vote, are harken back to the Jim Crow era. These are false and baseless claims used to justify the erection of unnecessary, burdensome, and discriminatory barriers when it comes to voting.
So one of the things the department is talking about is this so-called SAVE database as the panacea for identification of who all these illegals are. Mr. Norton, what's the risk of relying on a DHS database in your perspective?
Yeah, well, Ms. Marsden made some allusion to concerns that we share at the Brennan Center in terms of the reliability of the SAVE database in terms of not having accurate information on all citizens. Obviously, people are naturalized and become citizens, and that information isn't necessarily up to date. And we have seen in some states that have relied on the SAVE database making initial claims about having found hundreds of non-citizens that when they work through it, in fact, they find almost nobody who is a non-citizen on the rolls. And this has been true in, a deputy secretary mentioned Michigan and how few non-citizens they found on the rolls. It's been true in Democratic and Republican states when there's an investigation that is done. We just had this in Louisiana. We had it in Utah with very conservative AGs and secretaries looking into this. It's a vanishingly rare problem. I will say, in addition to concerns around the unreliability of the database that DHS is creating, I have security concerns about it as well. It is not at all clear to me from the information that the administration has put out. They're putting all of this information about private data about citizens into a database, that they are securing that information. And there are obviously a lot of concerns for all Americans about having a database with private information that is not kept securely by DHS.
Marston?
Yeah, to echo Mr. Norton's concerns, I think there are strong reasons to believe that the SAVE database is not an accurate reflection of who is and is not eligible to vote, and that's because that's not what it was created for. It was created by DHS to help states identify which immigrants were eligible for certain public benefits services. They've now, with the help of DOJ, shoehorned Social Security data into that system in a rushed and haphazard fashion that means any matches that it supposedly generates when compared to state voter data is highly unreliable as a source of evidence for whether someone is actually eligible to vote or not. And so what we've seen in the states that are already using the system is, as Mr. Norton said, they find that, in fact, the folks who are flagged are actually eligible voters. So it's a sort of problem. It's a solution in search of a problem.
Another one of the solutions that we hear from this administration is that with all these illegals voting, they are contemplating having federal officers at voting precincts to somehow identify these illegal voters. Just tell me, what would those federal officers at certain precincts do to people who would be coming to voting on Election Day? Mr. Commissioner, I'll start with you.
It would deter voters. We've had a very strong tradition in Michigan breaking turnout records these last 3 statewide elections because of the advances we've made in early voting and vote by mail and on Election Day. And people want to vote freely. And if we had ICE or other federal agents at our polling sites, it would certainly deter people from showing up to vote. One thing I just would like to piggyback on the other remarks is if we were to set up a type of save system or a system to require proof of U.S. citizenship. We've seen in Arizona that 47,000 people were denied the right to vote because of that system. That would roughly be the same in Michigan, and it's just something that we cannot have in this country.
Ivor?
We've been very concerned about that in Fulton County. Fulton County is a 70% Democratic county and a African-American majority county. Early voting in Fulton County started yesterday for the primary races in Georgia. And so we are very concerned about that and had been discussing that with our individual police forces across Fulton County, which has 15 cities in it, Atlanta being the biggest. And so we have tried very hard to make sure that Fulton County residents understand that we will do our best to put all of the things that protective measures we've put in place in the past and run elections as we always have, safely, fairly, and transparently. So we've given a lot of information. I spent a lot of time on social media trying to reach people at all levels to make sure that they understand to check their registration before they get there, to make sure that they have a phone number to call in case they encounter anything that feels uncomfortable, and to go early so that if there is a problem, they still have time to cast their ballot before May 19th. So what I'm trying to do is disseminate information so people can feel safer, because what the lies have done in Fulton County is just made people afraid to go to the polls, have made people think that there will be something that will happen when they get there. And that's just not true, because that's never happened. And so we're making sure that people have the information that they need and the resources that they need so they can safely go cast their vote, which early voting started yesterday.
Hello?
The NAACP firmly believes that ICE has no business being anywhere near our polling sites in this country, and we will resist this with every tool available to us. Armed law enforcement officials have no business being near our polling sites. We have state laws that prohibit electioneering for the precise purpose of ensuring that our polling sites provide a safe zone for voters. So we will use the courts and use every tool available to us to resist any effort to intimidate, discourage, or deter voter participation through brute displays of force this election season.
Norton?
I just want to double down on that statement. Deploying federal law enforcement to a polling place is illegal. It's illegal. It is illegal under federal law, and it's illegal under most state laws. One of the things at the Brennan Center that we are encouraging states to do is to adopt mirror laws that basically mirror the Civil Rights Act and other federal laws that make it illegal to send federal law enforcement to the polls, to hold accountable if in the case that the Department of Justice does not. To allow state attorneys general to hold accountable law enforcement who break the law. They are simply not permitted to interfere or intimidate voters. So I think that's very important to just start with that when we're talking about this issue. Any discussion of bringing federal law enforcement to polling places is illegal.
I'll echo Mr. Norton's emphasis on the fact that this is illegal, but also say that the administration and its allies making these open suggestions that they will send ICE to the polls is also part of an ongoing campaign to intimidate certain voters. And so we have to approach these suggestions, I think, with the goal of bolstering voters' confidence in going to the polls, whether that's using methods like early voting or vote by mail to if they're feeling concerned about the appearance of ICE agents at the polls on Election Day, and also making sure that voters have the information they need, who they can call if they experience voter intimidation, that state officials are prepared and working with their own local law enforcement agents to have plans in place for how they respond if these situations materialize. My fear at this moment is that we are hearing so much chatter about the risk of ICE enforcement that voters will be afraid whether or not anyone is gets actually deployed to the polls.
So that net effect of just the chatter by itself would mean that fewer voters potentially would come and vote.
Exactly, and I think that may be part of the plan.
Thank you. I now recognize other members for questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will recognize members based on seniority. Gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our guests today, the witnesses. Let me pull back a little bit. Homeland Security, created to defend America against foreign terrorists. Today, ICE shooting, killing American citizens on our streets. Let's forget about undocumented completely and for a minute focus on American citizens. Mr. Miller coming out and saying those agents have total immunity. That's what he said. Here we are today. Let me pull back a little bit. Back home, 1988, the Republican Party put up paid armed poll guards to stop American citizens from voting in Orange County, my city, Santa Ana, California. Private guards, so we were able to get some lawyers really quick into courthouse, get some restraining orders, and pull them back. Our new Secretary of Homeland has said that maybe selected polling places he will have agents. These are not going to be private security guards. These are going to be armed federal agents. Okay. Clashing with who? Local police? State police? Both armed? Bigger yet, this stuff will scare people away from voting. Heavily immigrant districts. Immigrants that have fought to get a green card for 30 years, fought to become American citizens for 40 years, and then you're telling them if you show up to vote, you'll be a felon. Nobody's going to take that bet. Give you another example. 2004, my predecessor running for re-election, Loretta Sanchez in my district, Republican Party sent out a letter to every Spanish surnamed registered citizen to vote. Every Spanish surnamed. If you vote under such circumstances, you're liable to be convicted of a felony. The damage was severe. We had to scramble and turn that whole narrative around, but the damage was done. You know, I'm trying to figure how to inoculate ourselves against what I know is coming. It's pretty clear. It's been played before. It's going to happen again, except this time, this play is going to be on steroids. I'm going to tell my constituents, vote by mail and vote early. Do not show up to the ballot box. God knows who's going to get shot, who's going to get killed in those situations. I'm going to ask each one of you, where do we go from here? I mean, Mr. Adevi?
Yeah, the concerns you've outlined are very serious, and it is a pattern over the past number of decades and, quite frankly, hundreds
You're talking
of years.
about this being against the law, stopping somebody. I think shooting an American citizen is against the law. Beating up an American citizen, arresting an American citizen for no reason whatsoever. We're all probably against the law. Probably stopping somebody at the polling place is against the law. Please.
It's absolutely against the law. And
I mean, could we come up with a private cause of action with maybe no statute of limitations so these guys who do this kind of stuff will think about maybe 2 or 3 times before they actually violate somebody's constitutional right to vote? I will be voting on Election Day at home. And so will some others too. But, you know, preparing ourselves for that ass kicking that's coming. Go ahead, sir.
No, I agree with you, and I will say this. I am constantly on the phone with our Attorney General talking about these issues. And if anyone violates Michigan law, we will investigate them, and they will be prosecuted. And we look to you and to this Congress to propose new laws and propose new measures to ensure that the people who act...
Well, Congress is not going to pass any new laws related to this till this next year, probably at the earliest.
But
Ms. Ivory.
we're working hard, and we stand with all the citizens across Michigan and across the country to oppose these measures, and we're working hard to put...
Ms. Ivory, any thoughts?
Yes. Thank you so much for that. As the daughter of an immigrant mother from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic and the first Afro-Latina commissioner on the Fulton County Commission, I think about this all the time, the way our citizens are affected by what they see and what they fear will happen in Georgia. But in the home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we cannot stop fighting for what is the only thing we can do, which is to use our power at the poll to change it.
I agree. Ms. Clark.
Congressman, ICE is not immune. ICE officers can be held accountable under federal law.
So they don't have immunity like
They
Mr.
do
Miller
not
said.
have immunity.
Thank you.
During my time at the Justice Department, we prosecuted federal law enforcement officers who violated the law, and I believe the day is coming when ICE officers who have violated our civil and constitutional rights will too be held accountable. But I want voters to know that in this moment, that organizations, churches, civic groups have galvanized and organized tremendous voter protection machinery to protect them. To protect and safeguard their right to go out and vote in person this election cycle, or vote by mail
Mr. Norton.
if they so choose.
Yeah, what I would say is communication is key in all of this. First, for people to understand what's happening, and that there is an effort to intimidate them, to keep them from voting, to keep their voice from being heard. Second, that in the states where there are officials who can do something about this, where there are attorney generals who can prosecute violation of rights, to say ahead of time that they are going to do it. And third, for civil society, the civil society that Ms. Clark was talking about, people shouldn't despair. They should have a plan. And that there is civil society out there to help them. There is early voting. There is mail voting, as you mentioned. And that at the end of the day, we have to make sure that by whatever means they vote, people feel secure going to vote.
I would say here, as in so many ways this year, the citizens of Minneapolis have started to show us the way. I think in the face of a threat of armed law enforcement at the polls, one effective counterweight is civil society organizing to provide peaceful, positive presence of citizens at the polls who can observe, can have cameras, can record if there is, in fact, federal misconduct at the polls. And I think all of us in civil society are thinking about how to help organize and support.
Constitutional, First Amendment constitutional right to videotape.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanagar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I thank all the witnesses for your passion, for your activism, your work in protecting our election process. I want to also thank all of you. I want to thank particularly Mr. Agogo David for being here, Deputy Secretary of State from my own great state of Michigan. And I have seen your work firsthand, and I thank you for all you've done. As many of you know, the Trump Department of Justice recently demanded voting records from Wayne County, Michigan, a place where I and nearly 2 million others call home. Yesterday, I sent this letter to the Department of Justice demanding answers as to why they are trying to intimidate Michigan voters ahead of the federal elections in November. Deputy Secretary of Michigan, the Department of Justice largely cited vague claims of election irregularities to justify its demand for the voter records. To me, this is an attempt to abuse the power of the DOJ to intimidate election officials and to send a message that the DOJ will use its power to harass jurisdictions that vote blue. Is there any merit to the DOJ's demand for election materials from the 2024 election? Are you concerned that the DOJ will use lawfare to harass left-leaning jurisdictions or invalidate election results it does not like in November?
There is no justification. When you can't even send the letter to the right entity, the right jurisdiction, you're showing you don't care about the law. You're showing a level of recklessness that demonstrates that this is about targeting individual counties, jurisdictions in a political fashioned way to get us to kowtow to the administration, and we will never do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what I see. And we saw also earlier, we saw this year the shocking raid on election offices in Fulton County, Georgia, with the now Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, in attendance. Has the DOJ threatened similar actions against Wayne County if they do not comply? If not, do you think it is possible that we could see federal agents raid election offices in Wayne County?
The actions that I've seen over the last year and a half of this administration have shocked me, and I take nothing off the table. We've not received any specific threats, but we're ready to defend our rights and our voters.
Thank you. And how would you describe the overall integrity of elections held in Michigan? How is Michigan ensuring that our elections are free and fair, and how are we holding those who violate the rules accountable?
Our elections are very safe. Since 2019, when Secretary Benson took office, we removed approximately 800,000 people from our rolls. It's top 5 in the nation. We have, in the recent election, 1.2 million early voters voted for the very first time in our state. So we have a great system.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary, for your answers today and for representing the great state of Michigan. I look forward to working with you to ensure Michiganders are not intimidated, not impeded from voting in the upcoming elections by this rogue administration. Thank you again. Thank you all. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Maria Magazina. I don't know why I'm trying to give you your name. For 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for making the trip out here today. Look, we know what's likely to happen in this next election. It appears, if the polls are accurate, and the feedback that we're getting about high prices and people being frustrated with the cost of living and frustrated with the war, it's likely that Democrats are going to win a number of seats in the midterms. And then, if that is the case, we know what will happen next, which is that President Trump will claim that the results were rigged, because that's what he does every time. Whenever he loses an election, he claims that the results were fake and the election was rigged. We saw that in 2020 when it led to a violent insurrection here at the Capitol. And we know that's going to happen because it always happens with him, because he is insecure, immature, and does not have the respect for the democratic process that a president should. But it's important for people at home to understand the incredible lengths that state and local election officials around the country are going to in order to make sure that our elections are secure and accurate. And so I just want to give some of our witnesses the time to explain what is being done, and I'll start with Ms. Ivory. Can you explain to the American people how the state of Georgia is securing its elections and taking steps to prevent any tampering with voter systems or voter databases?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. In Fulton County, we have always administered elections that have been fair, open, transparent, and they have been litigated, audited, and gone through lengthy processes to find error, and they have not been able to. So what we will do is what we've always done, is follow the law and administer elections in a 100% transparent and fair way for all citizens of Fulton County. And Fulton County citizens believe in our elections. They are not distrustful of Fulton County elections. They are distrustful of what our president will do with Fulton County elections. So we continue to educate. We continue to make sure that our voters have access to the information they need to feel safe when they go vote. Early voting is taking place in Georgia right now in Fulton County, and we're making sure that anybody who has any issues knows how to report them and cast their ballot fairly.
And I want to make sure people around the country understand. So in Fulton County in Georgia, do you use paper ballots or have paper trails?
We have electronic machines with paper ballots. They are put into the machine, they come out, and we store them, so they are both digitally scanned as well as paper.
All right, so every voter fills out a paper ballot, and those paper ballots are preserved after the election.
Yes, they fill it out digitally, and then it prints out, and then it feeds into the machine.
And after the 2020 election, for example, how many times were those paper ballots recounted?
More than 3 official recounts and audits, and then they were many times counted unofficially again, just for purposes of litigation. So many times.
Multiple times.
Multiple
and
times.
So every ballot is a paper ballot that is preserved after the election, and at least in the last presidential, the 2020 election, was recounted multiple times. How about Michigan? Mr. Edebe, in the state of Michigan, how do you ensure that your results have integrity?
We do audits after every major election, and it's of the procedures, it's of the machines themselves, and we also do risk-limiting audits to determine that the actual margin of victory was accurate as well. And this is in addition to all the coordination we do with our governor's office, with the attorney general, with local election officials.
So same thing, is there a paper trail for how each individual, anonymously, but how each individual has voted? You have a paper...
We have paper ballots.
You have a paper ballot. Those ballots are stored after the election.
Yes.
You conduct audits to make sure that the count was accurate.
Yes.
Okay. Can any of our other witnesses, just, perhaps Ms. Clark, just speak to how dangerous it is to have the President of the United States spread misinformation about the integrity of our elections and what that does to erode the public trust?
It's incredibly dangerous. On a micro level, we saw the impact of misinformation just recently in Virginia. A ballot initiative, black voters were targeted with misinformation, and organizations like ours, the NAACP, had to invest tremendous work and time to make sure that what was on the ballot was crystal clear for voters and to cut through the misinformation. Yeah. It's incredible to see it weaponized at the level of the White House.
Well, thank you. My time has expired, but I'll just underscore one last time. I think it's important that the voices of election officials at the state and local level be heard so that the American people understand how much work and how much process goes into making sure that every vote is counted accurately and audited after the fact. The whole purpose of this is not, of what Donald Trump is doing, is not to secure elections. It's to sow doubt and to ultimately divide our country. So thank you all.
I just want to make one point on your paper, your questions about paper. Fulton County and Michigan are not unique. 98% of the country, there is a paper record of a vote. The only place where that is not true is Louisiana. So you are talking about the entire country at this point, and I think that's really, a lot of people may not realize that, but there is a paper record to go back to everywhere in this country.
I guess the question is even when you recount, some people who requested it don't believe it. So it's like Well, this is how we do it. Now the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Chicago, Illinois, Ms. Ramirez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for convening this really important hearing, and for all of our witnesses who are here today joining us. You know, as I've been hearing our conversation and certainly the work that we've been doing here, what feels like 25 years, but really this Congress in this last year and a half, is that our president and authoritarians want to end free and fair elections, and they want to consolidate power so that they can remain in office. You see, the president is eroding our constitutional boundaries, and he's trying to normalize the abuse of our military power so that he can succeed where he failed his first term, to undermine our democratic institutions, to try to perpetrate a coup, and to try to hold our country hostage. How do I know this? Well, the president and his regime have attempted to eliminate mail-in ballots. We've seen him demand voter rolls in democratic cities. We've seen him raid election centers, as we've seen, fought and failed to pass the SAVE Act. And he's also threatened to deploy agents with guns to polling places across the country. When you take this all together, we can see what their end game is. One, they want to inflict terror to intimidate voters and try to suppress the vote. But two, they want to hold on to power by undermining public trust in elections and in the results of the elections when they're not convenient to them. The president harkens back to dark days and reflects tactics others have used before to intimidate black and brown voters and to keep all those who seek change at the ballot box from exercising the right to vote because he wants to inflict fear. But we're clear, these threats are not new. The bigotry, frankly, is not new. The tactics are not new. Our resistance is also not new. And like those who preceded us in the fight to protect our rights, we are doing this work because we're not going to be intimidated. During his Senate confirmation hearing, Secretary Mullen suggested that deploying ICE officers to polling locations would only be appropriate in the event of a specific threat, he said. Ms. Marsden, if you had to predict which specific threat Trump and his regime may cite to try to justify deploying ICE at the polls, what do you think that would be, and how would you expect it to play out?
I think the administration's focus on, their false claims of non-citizen voting and voter fraud may be one thing that they would cite to justify the presence of ICE at the polls. We know, according to recent reports, that Homeland Security investigations within DHS is starting to do voter fraud investigations. That is obviously concerning. I think that's not typically something that would have been within their jurisdiction, and we know that agency has been heavily politicized as well as heavily funded in this administration. So that is probably what I would look to first. I think in combating that narrative, it's important to really underscore the number of officials from both parties who have done detailed investigations to show that this is not substantiated and really, not cede any ground to the administration's claims here.
Thank you. And we know that during oral arguments earlier this month in Trump versus Barbara, the birthright citizenship case, Justice Sonia Sotomayor asked if the administration seeks to retroactively denaturalize people born to undocumented parents. The Trump administration had no real answer. So, Ms. Clark, this question is for you. If someone wakes up one day and the government tells them they were never really a citizen, even though they were born here like me, even though they've lived here their entire life, they are as American can be, do you think that person is going to feel safe showing up to vote? And isn't that fear exactly what this administration is counting on?
That's right. This administration is bent on sowing fear and discord and chaos across our country to discourage eligible people from voting. And the NAACP is committed to fighting back against this and to standing up for principles that shape and define the 14th and 15th Amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. I think especially about states like Texas, Arizona, Georgia, critical states, right, that we know that our colleagues on the other side are attempting to ensure that people that look like certain people don't show up and vote. So what you're saying is even though the law has not changed, the suppression is already happening. Yeah. Well, look, I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing. To our chairman, I call him chairman because he is the chair, and he will be our chair in January, for this conversation. We know that democracy is too delicate, it's too precious, and too significant to leave it in the hands of those who don't value it. So we appreciate the work that you do, and we look forward to working with you to make sure we're protecting the right to vote for everyone. Thank you.
Young lady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Buffalo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all of you for being here, for your incredibly insightful, thoughtful, and important testimony today. And I want to thank Chairman Benny Thompson for holding this important hearing, and really for all of the work that he's done on election integrity and security over the course of the last 2 decades as the chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. Election security, free and fair elections have been a priority. So again, Chairman, thank you for your leadership. Chairman also led the House Select Committee to investigate the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, which at its heart was about election conspiracy theories that we're hearing about in this testimony here today. It continues. And so I appreciate all of your efforts to be here today to bring this unique state-level experience to this perspective as we're going into election season and as our colleagues across the aisle are driving forward an agenda that would restrict voter access. It's so important that we are hearing about, learning about both what's at stake in the present as well as the history that brought us here. I had the opportunity to serve in the New York State Senate for the better part of 14 years and was very proud to help transform our election laws in New York to improve access and security and transparency in our elections. That included increasing absentee ballot drop boxes, expanding early voting sites, voting by mail, and improving election misinformation protections. The last priority, of course, particularly essential, given that the president is actively working to sow misinformation in our elections, undermine state procedures and protections, and block access to the ballot box, is part of a larger effort to ensure he sees the election results he wants later this year. As a matter of fact, he has dictated to Republican members of Congress that if they don't pass the SAVE Act, that it will restrict voter access for millions of Americans, they'll lose the election. It is blatant voter suppression, and it cannot be accepted. We've also seen troubling executive actions during Trump's second term in an effort to nationalize elections, empower the U.S. Postal Service to decide who can and cannot vote, and discredit state and local election officials like some of you here today who provide access to the polls. Commissioner Ivey, thank you for your testimony. You have direct experience navigating President Trump's obsession with the 2020 election results, which continues to manifest in troubling ways 6 years later, as you testified here today, namely the seizure of ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, early this year. And I got to tell you, I mean, I'm disgusted to hear of how that all went down, and I believe the people of America are as well. Again, intimidation tactics. How does that hearken to what you've seen historically in the past in Georgia?
Yeah, well, we in Georgia, we often call this era Jim Crow Part 2 because we feel that it has all of the elements of all of the racist and voting suppression tactics that were used against our community for so many years. And we even see it in legislation that is happening right now. That's why it's been so important for us in Fulton County to fight against the state election board appointments and the tactics that they are trying to use, as well as our local Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections when they tried to force 2 MAGA Republicans onto our board this year. That is how those conspiracy theories will continue to permeate through Fulton County when those type of individuals are on boards that have the power to then decide not to certify an election or decide not to follow the law. So we have to fight against those appointments at every level, locally and at the state level, because that is where we can shut down that power being exerted upon our voters. And I vow to continue doing that no matter what the consequences are.
Thank you so much for that. One of our great colleagues and friends in a real trailblazer here in Congress and in America is Congressman Jim Clyburn, who recently wrote a book, The First Eight, which details the dark days of the Jim Crow South that both you and Ms. Clark have spoken about. And I think it's important not just to talk about that sort of generalize, but what that actually means. Because, what I learned about in the book was about the gerrymandering, the intimidation, the violence, among many other things, led by the Klan, and then becoming the law of the land. That took from 1897, where the last black member of the House of Representatives was elected from South Carolina, 95 years, until our friend and colleague, Congressman Clyburn, was elected in 1992. That is the power of law, and it's also the power of why it's so important that we protect free and fair elections, truly free and fair elections. But if you could, Ms. Clark, because you referred to this as well, talk about some of those, if you could expand on some of that dark history of what we're fighting against and how the Klan and then ultimately the elected leaders use the power of the pen and the law to suppress the vote, and why we need to push back against that voter suppression today.
Yeah, the most powerful example of the display of ugly racial violence and voter suppression that we've ever seen in modern time was Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday. Shelby County was bad as well. But Congressman, I point that up because you and I walked across the bridge in Selma, Alabama, just a few weeks ago to pay homage to those who paid a tremendous sacrifice to bring us the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And at the NAACP, we'll do everything that we can to not see our country return to those dark days and to that treacherous moment. This administration is bent on using violence and hatred and chaos to discourage and instill fear. And we are focused and determined on ensuring that black voters and every eligible American is able to have voice in our democracy. And we do so remembering the history.
Thank you. And lastly, because I'm tight on time here, Mr. Chairman, I just want to add, maybe anyone on the panel can answer, but, along the same lines, the federal government has historically been engaged in making sure elections are free and fair, holding states accountable, at least post-Civil War. That was the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now we seem to see a change in tactics of the federal government, where now we see states having to stand up and protect themselves from a federal government overreach to suppress elections, free and fair elections. What do you make of that tactic?
It's time consuming, and it's designed to take us off the ball. Every election is a monumental event of working together with our 1,600 clerks across the state of Michigan to ensure that we have the ability to administer this election to 8 million people. But when you add on unnecessary things, it's designed to not allow those people to vote, and it's a grave danger to all of us.
Mr. Norton?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's harassment, frankly, of many of the officials, and I think it's worth noting that this administration loses every time it goes to court on these issues. Right? They're suing 30 states to get private data. There have been 5 decisions. They've lost all 5 of those cases. We have executive orders from this president, which are clearly violations of the Constitution. He lost on the first one in 3 separate courts. He's going to lose on the second one. But in the meantime, We have people who need to run these, who have a tremendous amount of work to do to make sure that we have free, fair, and secure elections, and they are being not just harassed but diverted from doing the jobs of serving their communities.
Thank you. As we get closer to the 2026 election midterms, I hope the congressional Republicans will take their duty seriously, call out the president's lies about our elections, and understand how dangerous it is for both our national security, our democratic institutions, and our nation's future. And I thank you all. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back and now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our distinguished panel for being here. I hail from the state of Texas, a place not known for wanting to expand the electorate, a state not known for citing on the rights of making it easy and possible for people to vote, but yet a state that's leading the nation in ways to restrict the right to vote and doing everything that they can in that regard. I think it's incredibly ironic that in the 250th anniversary of America's founding as a democratic republic, when we should be celebrating the value of its free and fair elections, Republicans have advanced multiple bills restricting every citizen's right to vote. Our democracy works best when every eligible voter has a clear and accessible path to cast the ballot, and I will always fight to protect that right. But there's a clear pattern of voter suppression being demonstrated by Republicans across the board. In April of last year, House Republicans passed the SAVE Act, which would have required proof of citizenship before registering to vote, creating a major obstacle for nearly 70 million married women who have a different name. And in Texas, we have thousands of people that don't have their birth certificates. You know, we have had Hurricane Harvey that has come in and destroyed millions of homes. And we've had hurricanes after hurricanes. We've had tornadoes after tornadoes. We've had so many weather events that have destroyed people's documents. And it is very difficult for them to get them again. Oftentimes some hospitals that, back in the 20s or 30s, they don't exist anymore. And some of these records have never matriculated up through accessible county records. And so this is a real significant issue. In December of 2025, Texas's governor and attorney general willingly passed over all of our voter rolls to the DOJ. And I've been still actively seeking clarity on how this data will be used and why the state has deemed it necessary to hand over constitutionally mandated control over elections to the federal government. And as a House administration's member of the subcommittee on elections, I've requested that we hold a hearing on the DOJ leadership to further investigate this issue. But shockingly, Mr. Chairman, they have yet to respond, and they've yet to been willing to appear to hold their actions accountable. And then in March of this year, Texas held its primary with record-breaking turnout, but Republicans changed the rules on Election Day, where to vote and polling locations, manufacturing confusion and turning voters away. And I really want to talk about this for just a moment. So in Texas, in Dallas County, where I'm from, we've had countywide voting now for the last multiple elections cycles through vote centers. But the Republican chairman of the Dallas County Republicans objected, because we have the parties run our primary as opposed to the state running our primary, and objected to countywide voting on Election Day, and we made it precinct-only voting. The problem is no one knew where to vote. And they only did this in 2 counties, mind you, in the state. The counties where both of our Democratic Senate nominees were from. The county of Dallas, where Jasmine Crockett is from, and Williamson County, where James Tallarico is from. No other county in the state saw fit to have to mess with the elections to destroy the experience of voters, but only the 2 counties where we have a very competitive Senate race. So those voters may not have had a great experience voting in the primary. And it's, somebody explained it like this way: you go to your favorite restaurant and you can go there 100 times and have a great meal, and then the time you have a bad meal, you won't go back. So if we create a bad experience voting, are we going to have those people not want to come back to vote again in November? I just found it so coincidental that the only 2 counties in the whole state. So I have a bill called the Vote Act that I encourage you all to sign on to that requires notification of polling places. Now, would that be hard to implement? Just to tell people where to vote? Please.
No, you could go to @TheMoIvory on IG right now and find it out in Fulton County, because it's just that easy to let our Fulton County voters know where to vote. We've had that information for weeks, if not months, when there is a change, perhaps because a neighborhood recreation center may have a leak in their roof, and then we can no longer hold it. We provide numerous forms of communication to notify voters of any change that might happen, and that has not
And so
happened.
what are those forms of communication that you utilize? Because that's one of the discussion topics in our bill is what should be reasonable communication for an entity to notify a voter, oh, hey, your polling place that you've gone to for the last 20 years is no longer there, and you should go here.
We send out notification through our neighborhood planning units. We, as commissioners, if any of those locations are in our district, we make sure to go personally, I do, to the neighborhood association meetings and let them know of the changes. We post it at our Fulton County Government Center. We put it on our website. We promote it on our TV channel, fgtv.com, and any other means that anybody can think of, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, in-person meetings, town halls. I held 5 town halls in 2026 just to make sure that voters knew exactly what they needed to know about early voting, which started yesterday in Georgia. So our constituents, our voters in Fulton, are fully knowledgeable about any changes that happen. And of course, it's on our website that they can go to anytime. So it's very available.
Well, thank you for that. Because, we in Dallas County, for our primary that we just had, we had over 30,000 voters go to the wrong polling location. And many were not able to ultimately cast their ballot because by the time they got to the correct location, the polls had closed. And then they were allowed to, a judge had ordered an extension, so they cast a provisional ballot, but then Kim Paxton came in and took that extension away, so those ballots were not cast. Another thing that has come up that I want to bring up, and I'm really curious, so recently, what we've seen now is people who are very much alive and living and breathing have been taken off the voter rolls as being dead. And that's happening in Dallas. It's happening in Fort Worth. It's certainly happening in Texas. I have multiple examples of where that has happened just in the last recent weeks. Why is that happening? What data is wrong with how people are being taken off the rolls for being dead when they're actually very much alive?
Well, we don't do that in Michigan.
So this is a Texas problem.
Yeah, well, it's a problem in states that are too aggressive in removing people from the rolls. Mm-hmm. We remove about 100,000 people from the rolls every year in Michigan who've passed away. We look at the Social Security Death Index. Our county clerks have the ability to look at medical records. But it's a very distinct process to ensure that nobody is accidentally taken off the rolls.
I have another question because I'm going to take advantage of this time with experts, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm over time, but I do have one more question for you. We are having a humongous problem with the Texas Secretary of State right now, updating the actual voter file. So, for example, we just had a primary March 3rd. We have a runoff in a month. We know from the vote count that we had 72,000 people vote in my primary, for example. But the Secretary of State can only identify 53,000 of those voters. What is going on? And why is that? And what advice do you have for us to be able to push back and hold them accountable for why our voter file is such an epic disaster?
Well, that election security can't be used as a cover for voter suppression. And that's what that is. We've had in Georgia a lot of purging of voters from the polls for inactivity if you didn't vote in so many different elections. Those are all voter suppression tactics. But I think it's important for the pressure to stay on. We applied that same kind of pressure in Georgia several times, and especially in Fulton County, to our Republican Secretary of State. and demanded that we see proof, and we've gone to court numerous times, and we've prevailed. And so I think it's a matter of consistent pressure on the Secretary of State. It's a matter of having people that are able to clearly identify where those issues are, and that 20,000 vote discrepancy needs to be cleared up. You need to stay consistent in asking them for where those ballots are, where those votes are, because if you don't, it will just go away. And that is the point, for it to just become a non-conversation. So all of this security, if that's what is being used as the excuse for it, is just a voter suppression tactic. And it will find its way to the legislature, because that's what always happens in Georgia.
Oh, yes, it will. Well, I thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for being, yes, ma'am.
If I may just add, every problem that you identified underscores why we still need to push for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And so I appreciate Ranking Member bringing us here to focus on the very urgent issues of election security. But it's also just such a reminder about why we need restoration of the pre-clearance process. When the Shelby County decision was issued, Texas was the very first state that raced forward with voting changes that have been blocked.
Yes, you are correct. You know, I was part of a group that broke quorum when I was in the state legislature over a voting rights bill, and one of the most egregious provisions in it that I cannot believe they actually put it in the bill was to make it a felony. Now think of all the things that constitute a felony in this country, all the terribly, really bad, horrible things. But it was going to be a felony conviction to drive more than 3 people to the poll. That conduct rose to the level of criminal conduct that constituted a felony in this country. That's what Republicans were putting forward. And that is why we marched our happy selves to D.C. and camped out for 6 weeks until they took that provision out. And because this kind of stuff is outrageous of what is happening. And I agree with you that at the last Congress, H.R. 1 was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I hope that when we take the majority, that will be H.R. 1 again. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Yeah, well, to piggyback on that, we have some registrars who are using credit reporting agencies as a method of determining validity for voter registration, if you can believe it. And we just came through that problem in our March 10th primary because people didn't know. And all of a sudden, they were using a credit reporting service for voter validation. So we have some problems. Chair recognizes the other gentleman from Texas on the committee, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses and welcome them. And yes, I am a member from Texas. The state of Texas. In 1944, in the state of Texas, if you were black, you could not vote in the white primary. But there was a man in Houston. His name was Lonnie Smith. He was a dentist. He took Smith versus Allwright to the Supreme Court. Justice Thurgood Marshall, Ms. Clark, was a lawyer for the NAACP. Supreme Court in a landmark decision ruled that you cannot have all white primaries. Texas complied with the law and decided that Texas would have all white pre-primaries. Texas to this day continues to find ways to deny people voting rights and to strip away minority representation. The preeminent, superb example of this would be what has happened with Texas being the first state that the president required to deliver additional Republicans so as to preserve power in the United States Congress. Texas delivered ostensibly But in reality, maybe not. Maybe not. Let me continue now with a predicate for a question. During the first year of his second term, the President signed Executive Order 14248, preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections. That's how it was styled. Didn't do that. Requiring a passport and other citizenship documents to register to vote. Directing the Attorney General to sue states that count mail ballots received after Election Day. You're very much familiar with the executive order. Now, let us review quickly an article from USA Today, November 4, 2025, 11:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, styled, "What did Dick Cheney think of Trump?" The late VP was a critic of President Trump. This is a quote. "There has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. Never an individual a greater threat to our republic. Given what he has done with this executive order, and given that we know that he tried to subvert and overturn an election, this will become the voir dire portion of our shadow hearing. As you know, voir dire is a French term. It means to speak the truth, or voir dire, depending on where you're from. So this is a truth-telling portion for you. Do you believe, I hate to ask you in this way, but it's a part of the predicate, do you believe that Dick Cheney's right? That Donald Trump is the greatest threat to the American Republic? If you so agree, would you kindly extend a hand into the air? All right, we have three people who do not agree that he is the greatest threat to the American Republic. So, Ms. Clark, NAACP is your bailiwick. Why would you contend that he is not the greatest threat?
Well, what I will say, Congressman, is that the NAACP, for the first time in its 100-plus year history, recently called for invocation of the 25th Amendment because of the serious concerns that the organization harbors about his fitness and ability to carry out his duties for office. So,
would you agree with me that that is a remedy?
Yeah, it is an approach. Yes,
that's a remedy. Yes. That's a remedy for a president who is not capable of fulfilling his duties.
Right.
I'm not asking you about the remedy. I'm asking you about the reason the remedy might be applied. Is he the greatest threat to the republic?
He is indeed a threat, a grave threat to our democracy. Indeed.
Okay. Would the democracy include the republic, Ms. Clark?
Yes.
Thank you. Next witness, sir, you did not indicate that he's the greatest threat to the republic.
I will certainly agree that many actions the president has taken are a threat to our republic, and the executive orders that attempt to extend presidential power over our elections are a deep threat, and they are clearly unconstitutional. But I also think our system is resilient, and I think at the end of the day, the republic is going to win out in this battle.
But you're indicating now that the system can resist the threat. The question isn't whether the system will manifest itself in such a way as to resist the threat. The question is, does the threat exist? Is he a threat? Is he a threat to the republic?
Yeah, I think there is no question that the actions that he has taken are a threat. There's no question about that.
To the Republic.
Yes.
All right. The next witness, please.
Thank you. Yes, I think I would certainly agree with Ms. Clark and Mr. Norden that the actions President Trump has taken, both with respect to the 2020 election, with respect to elections in this term, are a grave threat to the Republic. I think it's important to remember that, though, that he is part of a political movement, and that movement is embracing these policies kind of collectively, and so we shouldn't look solely to him as an individual as the source of the threat here.
I would not look to him solely as the source of the threat. But would you agree that the threat that these individuals are a part of, that threat emanates from the highest office because he has the influence to manipulate, and in fact, many of them are doing it because he is the threat, and they do support him. Do you agree?
I would certainly say that the federal government is posing led by President Trump, is posing a grave threat to the elections this fall.
So we all agree that President Donald Trump is a threat to the Republic. I mention this to you because there is a movement afoot now to contend that by simply acknowledging what Vice President Cheney called to our attention, by doing this, we are somehow becoming the source of some of the unacceptable behavior that we've seen as of late. There is a movement afoot among colleagues across the aisle and many persons who are part of this movement that you've referenced to somehow twist the facts and turn reality on its head and conclude that by being truthful about a circumstance that exists, we are creating, and I will say we because I sincerely believe that he is the greatest threat to the Republic. But by doing this, we are somehow creating an environment where people will do ugly things. I think we have to resist this. I don't think we can allow what he did to DEI, what he has done to Black Lives Matter. We can't allow him to now subvert the truth and somehow convince people that by telling the truth, we're responsible for dastardly deeds done. We have to resist. And a part of the resistance is to say that he is a threat to the Republic, which means he's a threat to democracy, which means he is subject to a remedy that the Constitution affords us. The framers of the Constitution were brilliant, regardless of what you say about them in their private lives and how they behaved. They were some brilliant people. They developed a Constitution for a time such as this and a president such as Trump. They did, because they placed in that Constitution a means by which, one of course being the amendment was mentioned earlier, a means by which a president can be removed when we're beyond the phase of electing. He's already in office. We're beyond that. But they gave us a remedy. And that remedy is impeachment. He has committed impeachable acts. The empirical evidence exists. The question isn't whether there is a way to deal with his dastardly behavior. The question is, do we have the will? Do we have the will? That's the question. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes young lady from New Jersey, Ms. Mahiha.
Sir, may I?
Yes. I hope I did.
You did perfectly.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for convening this critical hearing, and thank you to our witnesses as we know, we are marking the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, and we find ourselves in essentially facing a constitutional crisis. I agree with my colleague that the president is a great threat to the republic, and I also agree, sadly, that he is but a head of a movement's hydra. Sadly, one factor in a movement that is content to strip the American people of their rightful place in a participatory democracy. We know that we're confronting forces, again, headed by the highest office in the land, and willing to undermine our democracy, subvert our Constitution, and undermine the will of the people. President Trump, I agree, has not hidden these efforts. In 2020, he denied the results of a free and fair election. He made baseless claims that helped fuel an attack on our nation's capital on January 6th. And since 2016, he has repeatedly pushed unsubstantiated allegations of voter fraud, casting doubt on our electoral system, everything from mail-in voting to certified outcomes, frankly, everything in between. I'm going to jump right into my question because in order for us to protect our democratic institutions, we must ensure that we have an informed and engaged electorate. And so I wanted to ask our notable witnesses a couple questions. The first one is, what voter education partnerships or plans should we be fully apprised of and, in fact, participate in? How can we ensure that the American people are not only well-versed in the problems that we face, able to recognize the instances in which their freedoms are being encroached upon more readily, more quickly, but also understand what levers are available to the American people? That's question one. And then question two are, what key actions should willing and aligned state and local actors, elected officials, undertake in order to uphold the integrity of our elections? So this is very much a question of what do we need to know and how do we scale that information effectively so that we make better demands and take better actions to protect our democratic institutions and the integrity of our electoral system. And I would love to hear from all of you. I'm sure you have different vantage points, if that's okay with you.
That's a great question. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that every single one of you in this body has a voice to allow the people in your constituencies to know the critical information. Number one, there are multiple methods of voting. There's early voting, there's vote by mail, and there's, of course, voting on Election Day. And we do that by design in Michigan to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to vote. And so making that clear to people that those options are still available to them is important. The Trump administration, and I say this again, does not have any power to prevent a single eligible citizen from voting. And in these times when the president is deliberately trying to undermine that security and cause people to have fear, it's important that we all carry that message. And there are groups like the ACLU, the NAACP, that are doing work to ensure that individual voters have those reassurances.
Locally in Fulton County, we provide as much information to our voters so that there is nothing that they don't know, whether that's through a hotline number, whether that's through mailing directly to them, through commissioners like myself that have a very strong presence on social media, to making sure that we have as much contact with our local media outlets to get messages out. What I hear from my constituents in Fulton County is that from a federal perspective is that they wish that Democrats would meet the message that President Trump has in the same bold way that he speaks in speaks to Americans. They often say they can't really feel that sense of urgency or just the sort of straight talk they want to hear from our national leaders. So I would love for there to, I don't know how to make that happen. And that's a communications messaging piece that has to be perfected. But what I hear is that they would just like to see a stronger message from our national elected officials to say, because I know they know the work is being done. They know the fight is there. But everybody might not just see one representative on, say, a late night show, or might not just follow one. They would just want to hear that in a real straightforward way. And that's the comments that I get. Why aren't they fighting harder? But it's not because you're not. It's because they're just not getting that message. So I try constantly to come to things like this so that I can take the message back, and I want to be able to make that even louder in the targeted counties like Fulton County that President Trump is obsessed with. So I just love to hear it louder and in a more straightforward way for constituents.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The NAACP believes that the solution is a combination of legal advocacy and civic engagement. And that is the model that we have employed for decades. In 2024, we recruited and trained more than 100,000 volunteers across a dozen core states. We reached more than 14 million Black voters through direct contact, phone banking, digital organizing, and mail. And we believe that all of this is scalable across the country. What is most important is we want to make sure that voters have a way to sound an alarm if they see a problem or encounter a barrier, and we are prepared to mount rapid response litigation to push back and ensure that every voice is heard this election cycle.
May I ask a follow-up question to the points you made? You mentioned that you've trained 100,000 volunteers. Could you give some details on what sort of training you have offered, and perhaps how we can plug in or be a resource in expanding that sort of training to our own constituents?
Yeah, all of the training is kind of structured to the particular laws in a state, the particular challenges that voters have had historically. We look at voting rights trends. We host community town halls and education forums to make sure that we are, tailoring the message for voters in that community and training volunteers appropriately to meet the needs of voters in those areas.
I'll mention a couple of things in addition to the great work that the NAACP is doing. I know the League of Women Voters is planning on recruiting tens of thousands of election observers around the country, and I think that's going to be a very important thing for these midterms. I think more generally, making sure that voters know the various ways that they can vote and encouraging them to vote as early as possible is going to be critical this year. And I'll mention a last thing for election officials in your communities. There are a couple of projects that the Brennan Center is working on. One is with Protect Democracy and R Street. It's a bipartisan effort to coordinate work between law enforcement and election officials so that they are planning ahead of time and law enforcement understands what its role is and is not in elections. And I think planning between election officials and other agencies within their localities and states is critical. And another piece that's really critical that has been missing until now because it hasn't, frankly, been as necessary is for local government council to understand election law and what their role might be in the election if the Department of Justice shows up or if the FBI shows up or somebody else shows up, DHS, with a subpoena, and to understand what the proper response is. And the Brennan Center has been doing continuing legal education for county and town attorneys on these issues and has also started work with R Street and the Bipartisan Policy Center to start going around the country briefing council and election officials on the relevant laws that unfortunately they may have to know that they've never really had to know before in terms of what the federal government can and cannot do as relates to elections.
So we know that deceiving the public about the trustworthiness of elections is the first step, and maybe the most important step in the effort to subvert election results this fall. And all of us have a role to play in combating that and defeating that threat. I think one thing that members of Congress and other leaders can do is help people understand what is their role, what are the opportunities for people to get involved and ensure we do have a free and fair election this fall. That could mean sharing education about how to vote for individual voters, but it also means that there's an opportunity to build relationships with state and local officials to identify where there are needs for poll workers, or to connect with civil society and understand where are there programs where citizens can participate in ensuring that we have a free and fair election this fall. And as folks are increasingly, I think, concerned about the threat that's posed to our elections, one thing that is a role, I think, for members of Congress to play is helping connect folks who are concerned with opportunities to take action.
I just want to add one thing. Every cycle, there are congressional observers in the field during Election Day and during election periods to observe how things are going. I urge you guys to continue that, and also that if there are congressional observers from the other side of the aisle, that you match them out in the field and never allow them to be alone.
I yield. Forgive me.
Thank you. Commissioner Ivory, we know you have a firm departure date. We want to thank you so much for your testimony, and obviously it won't be your last appearance. We'll just forego the subpoena right now, but thank you so much.
Thank you. If you just might let me just say one thing in closing, is that we in Fulton County, we are so aware of what the president is trying to do to our elections in Fulton County, because what happens in Fulton County changes Georgia. And so we are working every day to make sure, and I thought it was a critical point that Mr. Norton said, that attorneys, that elections, county elections, commissioners and chairs understand the legal battle that we have in front of us. We did know that President Trump was coming to Fulton County. We just didn't know how. And so now that we do, we are fully prepared to continue to fight proactively rather than reactively. And I think that is so important in moving forward in all counties. And I just want to thank you. This is my second time coming to D.C. since the FBI raid. And I just want to thank you for allowing our voice to be here, because it's so important for people to know at the very localist of level is where it is happening and where things are changing and where his attacks are targeted in order to disrupt the system. And he tried to do it in Fulton, but the South has something to say, and we will not allow him to mess up our elections that are happening right now and that will happen in November. So I thank you so much, and I welcome an invitation to fly at any time to speak about Fulton County. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Chair recognizes gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Walkinshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, and to our witnesses for being here to talk about this really important issue. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, was established in 2018 to defend our nation against growing cyber threats, including foreign interference in our elections following Russia's attempt to influence the 2016 election. Election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure to ensure state and local officials had access to the cybersecurity tools and information sharing necessary to safeguard our democracy. And CISA delivered on that mission. It provided no-cost cybersecurity services to under-resourced election officials, supported threat intelligence sharing through the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and helped states prepare for and respond to cyber incidents in real time. But that commitment to election security changed when President Trump lost the 2020 election. Instead of accepting the results, he promoted his big lie conspiracy theory to undermine confidence in our democratic process. And when CISA Director Chris Krebs affirmed that the 2020 election was secure, he was fired by tweet just days later. And that moment marked a turning point in our commitment to election security. And today, President Trump took the Doge wrecking ball, the chainsaw, to CISA, slashing its workforce, dismantling its election security programs, eliminating trusted partnerships with state and local officials. CISA no longer provides specialized election security support, no longer funds the Election Infrastructure ISAC or the multi-state ISAC, and has effectively disbanded its election security team. At the same time, Trump administration uses baseless claims of fraud to justify unprecedented federal overreach into other areas of election administration, trying to nationalize control of our elections, intimidate election officials, and interfere in state and local processes. Those election officials, including some here today, face increased threats, fewer resources, less trust. More than half of them say they're concerned about political interference in the administration of their elections. They worry about their own safety, their own physical safety and ability to do their jobs. I think we have to be clear. Donald Trump's lies and actions are not about election integrity. It's about political power. CISA was built to protect our democracy from, among other things, foreign threats and adversaries. It's now being dismantled because patriotic public servants refuse to validate Trump's false claims and undermine the will of the American people. That's what's happening. I want to start with Mr. Norden. Can you just share from your perspective and your work how the hollowing out of CISA's workforce and the elimination of these key election security programs make it harder for state and local governments to administer the upcoming election safely and securely? What are the specific risks that these new gaps created because Donald Trump didn't like that Chris Krebs wouldn't validate his lies about the 2024 or 2020 election? What are the gaps that have been created?
I would say probably the biggest gap is the lack of sharing of information, coordination. So, and that, as I mentioned, 98% of voters will have a paper record of their vote. We can go back and we can go look at that. But when something happens, if there is a cyber attack, or if there are bomb threats, as there were in the 2024 election, there were hundreds. There's nobody to see in early what is happening, to communicate to officials, to let them know, and then to have early, clear response as to what is happening. So my biggest concern with the lack of this kind of coordination and service is that it will be another hit to public confidence in our system, because if and when something happens, it's going to be much more difficult for the American people to get a clear message, right? People may not have liked it, but following the 2020 election, CISA and other agencies in the federal government communicated very clearly about what they saw in the election, and I think that was an extremely important message to hear. I will also say, when we asked election officials in our poll, what are the government services that you think are most important? The things that rose to the top are the things that CISA used to do. So, cybersecurity training, finding out about what are the trends right now in security that they should be aware of, what new is happening. That is not happening at the same level. There are NGOs now that have stepped in place to some extent. So they're former CISA people working for the Election Security Exchange, and they are reaching out to election officials. But it just can't be at the same level. So when you have evolving threats, you have AI, you have other things, it's just going to be more difficult to see into what's happening and then to respond in a way that is reassuring to the public.
Mr. Adabe, Adebi, how have these cuts to CISA's election security programs, from your perspective, impacted your ability to prepare for and secure the upcoming elections in Michigan?
Yeah, it's been very damaging. We had CISA employees and officials work alongside us in table talks, exercises, actually go to physical places where voting was taking place, where votes were being counted, and assess the physical security. All of those relationships have been destroyed. We've had instances where our local election officials have been corresponding with members of CISA, and then all of a sudden there's no response because presumably that person has been fired. We are not an intelligence gathering operation, and this hurts us very badly.
Ms. Marsden, I'll give you the final word during my time here. We know that these programs worked, that they were effective, cost-effective. We know that the threat, if anything, has grown in terms of cyber threats to our elections. I'll ask you to maybe try to divine a motive here, but why would the Trump administration completely walk away from these programs that succeeded in helping our state and local election officials secure our elections? Why would they do it?
We've talked a lot about how the administration is spreading disinformation and misinformation about our elections, but the other flip side of that coin is that they are eroding sources of high-quality information about our elections and election security. So the attempts to gut, so the gutting of CISA is one good example of that. But I think you can also see a connection here to some of the attacks that they are making on the news media and media organizations, as well as other critics of the administration. So Chris Krebs himself, he was fired in 2020, but last year he was also the subject of an executive order directing an investigation into him personally, and those attacks on critics, prosecutions of critics, look like an effort to silence those who will tell the truth.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for organizing this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses that are here today. This is a very important hearing, so I'm really very happy to have the opportunity to not only meet you, but also to hear and have you all share your information and your insight on this. You know, at every single turn, President Trump has sought to undermine the confidence in our election and voting systems. In 2016, the president told voters that he didn't win. That it was because the election was rigged against him. So imagine, after losing to President Joe Biden in 2020, he concocted the big lie of fake widespread fraud that led to violent insurrectionists attacking our Capitol and police on January 6th. Now that he's back in office, President Trump has installed election deniers and key posts across his administration to undermine our elections. In fact, it seems that refusing to acknowledge that Trump lost in the 2020 election is a prerequisite for being in a senior role in this administration. In January, I asked Trump's director of cybersecurity, the man in charge of ensuring federal elections, to making sure that he was the person in charge of securing federal elections, are a simple question. Did Donald Trump win or lose the 2020 election? And you know what? He absolutely just literally refused to admit that Trump lost. Make no mistake, countless officials have repeatedly refused to confirm election results while under oath in other congressional hearings. We've seen that. To all the witnesses here today, I'd like to ask you, this is a yes or no question. Are you equally concerned that the false claim that Donald Trump won the 2020 election has become normalized by officials across this government?
Yes, I am concerned.
Yes.
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 Thank you. So, if so, what is your one recommendation that you have to debunk these baseless claims of election fraud and ensure that the public that are in the upcoming elections this year will be safe and secure?
Say the truth. We conducted over 250 audits in Michigan after the 2020 election, which all verified the results. We will conduct another audit after this election cycle. We are going to ensure that everyone who wants to vote in Michigan, who is eligible, will have a voice.
I agree. Continue to speak the truth and to not be distracted. There's an important midterm election cycle, and we need to continue to work to ensure that every voice is heard this election season.
I would agree with that. I think it's important for all of us to be supporting our election workers and election officials who are making sure that we have free and fair elections. And I would just repeat what the Deputy Secretary said. As I said earlier, 98% of the country, we have paper records for votes. We can always go back and look at them. That should make people feel very secure. That if people are allowed to go vote and cast their votes, we're going to have accurate results.
Thank you for that.
I agree with that, and would only add, in addition to telling the truth about the many layers of security and verification that are built into our system, I think it can be important to explain why the administration is telling these lies, that these falsehoods are part of a campaign to cling to power. It's not just a battle over the facts. There is a strategy at play.
All of you for sharing your thoughts on that. You know, just last month, President Trump issued a sweeping executive order directing federal agencies to create a list of so-called verified citizens and restrict the ballot access only to those individuals on the list. This illegal power grab would make it harder for Americans to vote. That is why many state officials and legal experts across the country have condemned the order. Several weeks ago, I led our entire New Jersey Democratic delegation in a letter to the Postmaster General calling on the U.S. Postal Service to reject any implementation of this illegal executive order. Mr.
Adavier.
This executive order would direct federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, to create lists of eligible voters and then send them to states like yours. What concerns do you have with the federal government telling you, sir, who is in your state is eligible to vote and who is not? How would this order suppress voting participation in your state?
Devastating. One thing to note is that the federal government does not have a complete database of who is a citizen in our country. One problem is that the Social Security Administration did not start to consistently take citizenship information of people who were born before until 1978 of people who were born in this country to ensure that they were listed as a citizen. So that group of people born before 1978 is 4 million strong in Michigan. That's half of our eligible citizens. So we just can't have that because it would just destroy the ability to really understand who's eligible to vote in our elections.
I just want to follow up that answer with something that I just heard. Perhaps maybe you can help to debunk this as well. My understanding is that they're also looking at some of, like, for example, what is the credit scores or credit information from some of those folks on that list and trying to compare that. And if there's any difference, they'll indicate that they're not the person who they say they are, or that they're not eligible. Has that come across any one of your desks or information? Not sure if that, can anyone speak to that?
We certainly haven't done that in Michigan, and we never would because that's not accurate.
No, I'm not asking if you have done it. I'm saying, have you heard that that is being used as a method of determining whether or not someone should be on that list or would be eligible to vote? It looks like Ms. Clark, would you?
Yes, very, very briefly, Congresswoman. Yes, we have seen this. We believe it is unlawful. It violates the National Voter Registration Act, which sets forth very clear parameters that should guide states in their efforts to ensure that their rolls are accurate. And Ranking Member Thompson mentioned a similar effort afoot earlier in this hearing, and this likely violates the NVRA. And with respect to the SAVE Act, there is a strong and robust effort to hold the administration to account for this in the courts. The NAACP, along with its partners, is suing to stop the executive order that you mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Clearly, it's important for all of us to understand that the right to freely vote in our election is without question a fundamental. It's fundamental to our democracy, and I just want everyone to understand that I am truly dedicated to making sure that everything that we can do to protect the rights of every single person who is able to vote are given that opportunity, and that they're able to exercise their civic responsibility. And that's what we should certainly look to do to protect every single voter all throughout the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Our Secretary of State did that for the last primary in Mississippi, so I want to give credit where credit's due. But our state NAACP head, Charles Taylor, is taking the lead on making sure that that's not the case. And so one of the reasons we had to have this shadow hearing as Democrats is our Republican colleagues wouldn't hold the hearing. And we think, given the upcoming midterm elections, the executive orders, and things that we see and hear every day causes us enough concern that we put this shadow hearing together. We could not have found a finer panel of witnesses. There's no question. What you've told us today become part of a record that we plan to use. We plan to highlight it with not just the Democratic caucus, but the community at large. And it's very helpful in that respect. I'm one of those persons who was federally registered to vote because my city clerk wouldn't allow black people to register in my hometown. There's so many reasons why I'm personally involved in it. And I'll give you one caveat. I became mayor of my little hometown in 1973. And fortunately, I won, but the local losers took me to local court. On the morning of court, we removed it to federal court because of the Voting Rights Act. The judge said to the people who brought the charge of contesting the election, said, well, they've taken it out of my hand. I can't do anything for you now. Now, that was the person who was going to make the determination on the case. Had it not been for the Voting Rights Act, I probably would have not been able to serve as mayor of that little town. So there is a place for federal legislation to ensure not just access, but participation in the process without fear of intimidation or anything else. And so that's why the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is important. We're going to look at the redistricting part of it because it needs a little tweaking. And I think we've resolved that part. So thank you, witnesses, for your valuable testimony. And obviously, all our members who mixed other things in the process, but they came and got their points in, and we thank them for their participation. If there's no further business, this hearing is adjourned.